gentleman to the left of me just talking about how the CCBA, the CSBA back then got started. Maybe what were some of the issues that made you think to create the organization, and I was also curious too. Were there even any allies, at the legislative level in those early years when you had the idea, 25 years ago, to start this organization?
I'll kick it off and hand it to Fritz because it really is genesis. I do recall a phone call from Fritz saying we need to start a small brewing organization in California, and I think Fritz fill the details, but I think there was a bill that was in committee or being presented that was going to take away self-distribution.
It took away the right to be both a wholesaler and a retailer.
And so I got a call, and I remember we just moved into our offices, and we came up to Chico. I think we brought it up. I'm not sure if he was told at the time or not.
Yeah, actually, I looked it up this morning to refresh my memory. I Googled an assemblyman whose name I remembered, which was Rusty Arias. In '88, the beer wholesalers got him to sponsor a bill that basically prevented you from being both a wholesaler and a retailer of beer and wine. In my pursuit of this, I went onto the California Beer Wholesalers Association website this morning, and I got this. Since the repeal of Prohibition over 70 years ago, California law, supported by the 21st Amendment of the United States Constitution, has required beer to be distributed through a three-step system of licensed brewers, wholesalers, and retailers. It's nonsense. I hope everybody in this room knows that the beer wholesalers have been fighting probably since Prohibition to shut down, in California, to shut down the right of retailers, of breweries and vendors to sell their product at retail. They would like to have it be illegal to sell to anyone other than a wholesaler. And I used to say we don't have a three-tier system in California mandated by law. We have a three-tier system that works commercially. It works very well. But many of us wouldn't be here if we hadn't distributed our own beer. We were our own wholesalers for a long time. I would guess there's somebody in this room who's wholesaling beer today. Maybe still doesn't have one of those wonderful beer distributors. These guys are just vicious. Lions are vicious when they see meat. It's it's not evil. It's not wrong. It's just natural to fight for your stuff. And the beer wholesalers had passed a law in '88 that was designed to squeeze some more on the three-tier system that they want to mandate. It must have been a little thing. I don't remember what their story was. But it turned out that Rusty Arias, who was a very popular assemblyman from Paso Robles, I think, somewhere down that way, was behind the bill. And it just went right through the legislature, and Duke Majan signed it, and it was the law. And suddenly, people like Kermit Lynch, the very famous importer of French Burgundy, was shut down. He couldn't be both an importer and a wholesaler and sell retail. Wineries that had a tasting room outside the winery couldn't sell wine to the public. At our brewery, we couldn't sell, I forget what we couldn't sell. I think we couldn't retail beer anymore. I can't remember. Well, it was an outrage. And Rusty Arias was mortified to discover what he had done. And Kermit Lynch, who was a real leader in the fine wine world, directed me through my attorney to Bob Judd, who was acting on Kermit's behalf in Sacramento, to try to fix this problem. And Rusty Arias was so embarrassed that he just got right in the traces and took over and helped. And we just eliminated that part of the law. But it was obvious to me that this had happened because nobody had even thought about talking to any small brewers. You know, when you have alcoholic beverage law, as the ABC lawyer explained to me years ago, it's a sumptuary law. It has nothing to do with common law or what's right or wrong. It's a compromise of all the forces that are concerned about alcohol. and that's where it is today, and it can be changed. There's no precedent, it's just what it is. So the wholesalers, of course, are always trying to change it towards better for them. And when you change the law, you go, first you have an idea, then you go to the wholesalers and get their permission. Not to agree with it, but not to object. And then you go to the vendors, and if they agree not to object, you go to the distillers. And if they agree not to object, then you go to the committee and you start to try to pass your law. Nobody ever comes out in favor of these things. They just look at it and say, well, we don't have any problem with it. But they didn't call the small brewers. There were only a handful of them.
And interesting fact, Russian River was actually a state graduate.
Oh, that's right.
Was head. He was college president, student body president.
Anyway, so when we started it, I said, look, here's the theme. What we want to do is to have an organization such that has enough oomph that before anyone can pass a bill in Sacramento, they have to call us. Not that we'll have a lot of power. Our threat always will be to raise a big stink about how the big distillers or the big brewers or the big wholesalers are causing us a problem. The stink usually isn't very big, it's the threat of the stink. You know, go to Sacramento and with signs, they'll have to call us. And if they have to call us, then at least we can get involved in thinking through what's actually, whose interests are being served and all the rest. And it took a few years, but we certainly succeeded.
The other thing that was missing was we didn't have any eyes and ears to watch some of these laws getting modified last minute. I think that's where Bob came in. At least he had a pulse of what was happening. He knew enough people that he could give us the heads up.
And he was a lobbyist in Sacramento, primarily for the chemical industry. Interestingly enough, he was very much of an environmentalist in his attitudes, but he was also a lawyer and a legal type and understood what lobbying and the chemical industry needed to be represented. And so he took us on as a kind of a little side job. For a long time, he was just trying like mad to listen and to learn us.
Yeah, his first experience wasn't probably that good with the brewers. He called me. I'm not sure why. I think he just started looking at the yellow pages, looking for brewers. He called me and said, hey, we'd like to start this organization. We have these, problems up in Sacramento. I'm looking for Fritz on something. And he convinced me that maybe I should talk to some of the other brewers that I knew, like CFS, that sort of thing, to get together, try to get a little meeting together. So we planned one. It wasn't a smart thing to do, but at the Beer Fest up in Sacramento, at the Holidome. I don't know if you guys, it's gone now. It's a Holiday Inn right at Highway 50 or Highway 80 and Business 80, and had a beer fest. Back in those days, a lot of the brewers, drink their share and give away the rest. It was quite a raucous meeting after the thing. It turns out just a few years ago, I found out who organized that beer fest. That I think was Tom McCormick. That's probably why it was so raucous, I think. But Bob came away from that with people were not excited about it. They're going, we got into brewing to get away from stuff like this. We don't want to have anything to do with politics, and we don't want to join a club. We're brewers, and it wasn't a great start, but we managed to have another meeting. I think it was at Devil Mountain Brewery, and that was a little more sedated.
You're really bringing back some memories, John. My memory of this is that there was a division among the brewers. Some of us, obviously the smarter, more responsible, we were worried that this beer fest or ones like it were clearly out of control and that were basically a liability of being proven to be encouraging people to drink too much, which is always a problem, isn't it? I mean, it is. It's such a question. It's a challenge. But we tried, I remember trying to get this association to sort of have an influence, and that may have alienated some.
Well, early on, that was the sole source of income of the organization was beer festivals. Back then, beer festivals were phenomenal. Back in the late 80s, and they were really Wide, and raised a lot of money that way. But it wasn't a liability factor.
But come to think of it, I mean, as you point out, they were a whole new phenomenon, and it was a wonderful influence, benefit for all of us.
We've got the brewers close to each other. You know, they spend every weekend together. I see Steve Harrison probably more than you did. He was traveling all the time. It was almost every hauling kegs. He was setting up. He was setting up the tent, that kind of thing. It's just to bring the brewers together every weekend. It's something that not every state had back then. I think my brother had a brewery up in Washington, and they didn't allow beer fest for a while up there. And the brewers were all very suspect of each other. They didn't know what to do. But when you spend all this time together like we're doing here, it really makes a difference in what an industry to be involved with where those weekends.
You know, the other thing I think that we should at least make note of is that there was dissension in the ranks of some of our members as far as their goals. And that was a big concern early on, is we just make sure we get a group at least on the board that has a pretty clear vision. I mean, there was a lot of calls to get rid of all trade practice laws and why can't get away coolers and rules.
Yeah, Fritz used to say.
Yeah, so
Fritz used to all say, well, someday we might have two associations, a brew pub association and a production brewery association. Because at the time, there were different thoughts. The brew pubbers didn't know why they couldn't give away a T-shirt. Didn't seem to make any sense, regular bar could, I suppose. And so for us, we struggled with that in the first few years. What's been interesting since then is almost every brewer, I think every brewer on the board except for Brian, has both a brew pub and a production facility. So it all kind of melded together over time, but it wasn't like that.
I'd forgotten that. I was always adamant that we should never divide a brew pub from a brewery. They're all breweries and we're all in this together. It was just an instinct I had that it's a fraternity. But you're right, it was a real problem. Also, another one, maybe you remember, notice that we veterans, or what are we, the Hall of Fame, notice
Pioneers.
if you want to be in the Hall of Fame, you want to wear a blue shirt.
Right. That's why I'm white.
We were all Northern California brewers, notice. We had a real challenge in the early years trying to get, it's a long way to Southern California, and most of them, all the brewers were small. And we just knew we had to have a statewide organization.
We took a trip down there.
We used to go down there. We went to them.
Right. I think about 6 people showed up.
Yeah.
While we're talking about brew pubs, could we go back and talk about how the law became, were you involved with that, Fritz? Making it legal to have a brewery and a restaurant together?
Well, I don't really want to remember all of that because I made some enemies. I felt strongly in those days that the tied house laws were good and that brewers should not, for example, brew pubs should not sell distilled spirits. I did help to write the law in the sense that I wanted brew pubs, breweries to be able to sell wine. I thought that to have a successful restaurant, you really should be able to sell wine in addition to beer, that it was a ridiculous limitation to say, oh, we're just beer only. Why not include wine and include the people who maybe wanted to have wine with dinner? And I felt strongly about that, but I did make some enemies. There were lots of stages in the laws. There may have been even some changes since I've been involved, but I did object to selling distilled spirits in the brew pub. And then I objected to having more than, 8 or 10? There's a limit to the number of retail distilled spirits. 6. I made a real enemy out of our friends in San Jose. It was a whole series. Well, you know how that goes.
It wasn't just them though. There was a number of restaurant chains that were really.
Oh yeah, they couldn't wait.
Yeah, actually got past us, I think. It looked like a patronage bill that would just allow this one company to be able to have alcohol and their things, but as it turned out, the way it was interpreted, it was for everybody.
Yeah, that's right.
And we were very against that for years. I don't know what membership thinks now, but we didn't want hard liquor attached to the brewing license. I think the board was pretty clear for a long time.
Fritz, at least from the wine part, I know Natalie thanks you for being able to drink wine in a brew pub.
But you know, I was thinking earlier today, I've been involved in several trade organizations, two others in the brewing business. The Brewers Association back in the 60s, when it was basically the old small local family breweries. And we were the only brewery trying to do more interesting things. The leader of that, Bill O'Shea, was a remarkable character. He just ran it. It was his show. And the brewers tended to be separate enough that they didn't compete with each other, so there was a camaraderie that was hard to imagine. They would meet once a year for a big convention, and I went. The first time I went, I snuck in and just looked around at all these people with neckties on. And we were in Chicago at the big hotel. I just looked around because I owned a brewery now, and I left. But then there was the USBA, especially under Henry King, which was a great example of a trade association. And I think with those experiences was why I called around and said, hey, we can start one, let's get something going. I saw both the difficulties within an organization of coming up with common policies when in fact there are different issues, but also the fantastic power of an organization that has a name and some stationery and somewhere a leader who organizes. If nothing else, you can avoid being stepped on. And I really admired both of the men who ran those associations. They were brilliant characters.
Fritz, you urged me to join the BAA back in 1982 or 3. I remember. I felt like you were one of my first meetings, and it was Fritz and me, and Fritz had a bushy beard.
If you can imagine.
And you were president early 80s, and then obviously we moved into King well, and that was a trade association that served its members very well until it imploded due to infighting of the brewers. It was a very powerful legislative group. Good lessons learned.
You remember the BAA convention when they would have a dance after dinner, and they were from Wisconsin and Minnesota and Pennsylvania, and out in the country, and they would dance polka and schottisch, and I loved it, I must say.
And actually, we need to start that here. We would sing it. There would be songs led by the director, and so we all had to learn a whole range of songs. And, late at night, we would just sit around the piano and somebody play. I definitely felt like it for it.
But didn't you quickly begin to feel like a member of the club?
I learned some of those too. They're just sort of the amazing thing, these old breweries from way back when, and all family that have run them for a long time.
And not only breweries, I mean, the maltsters were there, the hop guys, and they had been coming for 30, 40 years, in some cases several generations. So that was that true family in the industry of those days.
I was in a room one night in Fort Lauderdale at the annual convention, a small hotel room at a pre-dinner cocktail party, and there were 5 Fritzes in the room. I knew I was one friend.
So John, your business model with Triple Rock was always a brew pub from the beginning. It's rare that a restaurant stays in business for 10 years, let alone nearly 30, and you're 2 years away from 30, which is impressive. Natalie and I have been in the restaurant business now for 11 years, and we jokingly say we just signed another 10-year lease. We might have 10 more years in us, but when that third 10-year term comes up, I'm not sure. So, well done. But I'm just curious what it was like back then. I mean, to go into a brew pub, there was only a handful in America at that point, and what did people think? Brew pub is right like you're a coffee house or something.
Well, that's why we had to put Triple Rock, or Roaring Rock Brewery, in the ale house, so people would know that you could actually buy the beer there. My story's kind of a long story now, I won't go too much into it, but I was actually about to graduate from Oregon State, and I had an entrepreneurship class. There's a case study group. There's a brewery called Cartwright. I don't know if you guys know that.
Oh, yeah.
And
save his infected beer.
Right. So they ask us, okay, what are we doing wrong? And once you taste the beer, you do. What I found is that we looked at their books and all this kind of stuff. It just seemed to me like the most, why would anybody do this? You know, I knew of the painter, but I didn't know a lot about it. I didn't know about you yet. Why would anybody go up against the big guys? Why would they, fight on the shelves for space? All that kind of thing. But one thing I did learn was, well, it seems like brewing beer isn't that expensive. So went on I got out of school about a year or two later, was listening to K1 radio out of Ukiah, a little family property that we have up there. The DJ said we're bringing on a guy who's starting a brewery in Hopland. I'm thinking to myself, well, what a dumb idea. I mean, I just say this, there's no way that he's ever going to make it. So Michael Laybourne gets on the horn there and starts talking about what he's going to do. And so the DJ asks him on the horn, well, you're going to put this in bottles and sell it up against the big guys? And he said, no, we're just going to sell it in pint glasses across the bar. And that's, for me, that was that light went off moment where I thought, oh, that could work, actually. So that's what we did. We were there right at the opening of Hopland. Got to know them pretty well. I thought if I could work in a town of 800, maybe I could work in Berkeley. So.
Were you brewing?
My brother Reed was a brewer. That was the worst deal I've ever made. Was Reed was going to be the brewer. He had more homebrewing experience than I did, and I would run the pub. So I thought, well, that's pretty good. Within 6 to 8 weeks, he hired a brewer, and he's never done it since. There's still 50-50 partner. So that time out that he really knew how to make the deal. So I'm still running the pub.
Natalie says the same thing. She got the restaurant, I got the brewery.
So you know what I'm talking about.
I thought this morning maybe I would tell John something which is a true story. Of course, as you get older, you realize sometimes what you remember isn't your point right. But my memory of John was, in the early years of this association, was that he was just as solid as a rock. I was just thrilled with him. He just always said the right thing. He showed up. He had a common point of view. But I couldn't quite figure out where his brewery was. You had an office in the city, right? Didn't you come from?
I was over in the city, but
Yeah.
I lived over there.
Yeah.
But then I started the brewery near you guys.
Yeah, of course. But you had the one in Berkeley too, right?
Right.
And I never was exactly sure where it was because I was so busy I didn't go to brew pubs, how it is, I'm sure. So here was this guy who was just terrific, and I wasn't quite sure where his brewery was.
To get you to come by.
I sort of knew, but I didn't. I sort of didn't. And I think we had a meeting once.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing that we appreciated is you were treasurer for I don't know how many years, but that was
That was more
We
like
needed the treasurer because Ken and I didn't trust each other.
Actually, the treasurer job was more like a membership chairman job. We wrote one check a month to Bob Judd. That was about it, and a few other things. But it was all about membership. And back in those days,
There weren't a lot of members.
There weren't a lot. It was very difficult to get people to spend $150 a year, and what was it, 15 cents a barrel. And Tom knows this was just 7 years ago or so when he started, how hard it was to get membership back then. So we appreciate every single one of you here today.
Now, a few of you I've talked to about this, that the exact location of the Hyatt Hotel that we're in today is the old Grace Brothers brewery, which was at the time a very well-known local brewery. They had something like 50 labels, but they would make 2 beers and just, put them all into different labels. But I've heard Fritz talk about before in the early days that he didn't brew enough beer and to have a regular supply of yeast. But maybe you could talk about those days. And
I never crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, but what I remember what it was like to drive up to Grace Brothers. In those days, we made a brew about once a month. 50 barrels. In the winter, less than once a month, but in the summer, maybe once a month. And I figured out right away that microbiology was our big problem, like you were saying with the brewery up in the Northwest. It's hard to sell sour beer. And some of you may not have ever done that. I have done it. I have actually sat at the bar and smiled and drunk my own sour beer.
That's sour beer, that's not supposed to be sour.
Yeah, really, I can't buy them. Anyway, so I figured out right away that keeping yeast from one brew to another in an old refrigerator that didn't work very well in a milk can really was not the way. And so I started getting, mind you, I had gotten some very good advice, very practical advice from a man named John Bauer, who had been a consultant. He worked actually with one of the big companies that sold things to breweries, and he used to go around the West and consult with brewmasters. He gave me some very quick, very practical advice in my early years. And I realized we got to get fresh yeast. We can't keep our own yeast. The bacteria grows so fast it's out of the question, and the beer's sour before it even goes into the cellar. So I started going to the lager breweries and getting yeast from them in a milk can that we had. And I would alternate. I went to Falstaff in San Jose, and then Lucky Lager, and then Falstaff, Lucky Lager, not Meister Brau. What was the last one to close? The big one. Berkey. And there was no Budweiser then, and Grace Brothers. And I would alternate, call the brewmaster and introduce myself and say, well, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to come and get some yeast. Oh, sure. That was one of the first times I got that feeling that I'm sure we've all had of being part of a trade. The production brewers knew we were all part of a trade. We were in it together, and they were eager to help, and they respected us in an absurdly irrational way. They sort of treated us with respect. And